Greetings, everyone. Today we are here to talk about the Senate and people of Rome. As you see right there on the Eagle of Rome, something which many countries have copied over time, possibly to draw upon the greatness of which is the Empire of Rome, which did not start as an empire. It started as a kingdom, which then became a republic. You might have heard of that kind of governmental system, and eventually transitioned into an empire. Once it got so large, the wieldiness of the republic became an issue. We're going to talk about that. Those are two different lectures: the beginning of Rome as a republic and the transition of Rome into an empire. So this week we're looking at the republic phase, from kingdom to republic. So when we look at Italy, we've already been talking, of course, about this region here, Macedonia and Greece, and Asia Minor over this way, parts of the Middle East, and now we're up over here. Okay, so this region is going to develop itself into a major kingdom finally as we move into the Roman period. There were already large kingdoms in Italy. It's just that we're looking at this new one that becomes so important to our Western tradition. So, more geography. The Alps, when we talk about the Alps, we're talking about this region right here. This, you might remember when we talked about Egypt, how the region of Egypt developed largely apart from other cultures for a long time and allowed them to get kind of a sense of complacency and a very long history of slow, considerate development without a lot of invasion. Because the fact that Egypt is surrounded by mountains to the south and by deserts up in the north. Italy is a weirdly kind of similar. It's got oceans surrounding it. It's covered in mountain ranges, which means that there's some natural protection there. And of course, to the north, it's not just mountain ranges; it's the Alps, which are massive, massive mountain ranges. So, getting a lot of invaders coming into Italy was not something that happened on any large scale. You had coastal attacks and that sort of thing, but nothing like major armies coming in. So we have this the mountain barriers, the Alps in the north, and of course the Appian Mountains coming down this way. In a lot of ways, Italy reminds me of California. It's got a lot of the same kind of Mediterranean climate as well as the mountain ranges that separate different groups from each other naturally. In fact, these pictures could have been taken easily in Temecula or parts of San Diego County or up in Napa. But these are Italy, right? So here we are. Rich agricultural land is something that Italy still has. And then, of course, this, which you need for any real kingdom, you need to have these resources right here: copper, iron, and tin. Remember, when you compare copper with tin, you get bronze. And so Italy is able to move into the Bronze Age relatively quickly because they've got the resources. And of course, they have iron, which means that they can move into iron and steel production once they refine that ability as well. They don't have to import that stuff. Once again, like all other ancient cultures, we can only talk about what the people themselves told us their heritage is. We don't have any records that show how Rome itself started or exactly how the Etruscans, which we'll talk about in a minute, became the Romans or anything of that sort. We just have the stories that the Romans told about their origins, and that's true when we talk about other cultures. We sort of get that kind of thing where it's a little bit based on the kind of a mythical style origin story because humans love those. So we get to this idea. There's this region, and the reality is that just like many ancient cultures, you start with having a king, some kind of warlord that can basically rule a small town or a cluster of towns and finally a kingdom. So this was very much the way that Sparta did it, actually, which was to have an elderly council or a council of elderly men who basically were the ones that created the laws and enforced the laws, and then you had some kind of king that did the overall decision making. Here's the region today. Okay, so what did the Romans say was their origin story? Basically, we have the story that in 753 BCE, which is about the time that you've got Athens and Sparta and all them entering the classical Greek phase. Around 753 BCE, Rome's first king, a guy named Romulus, again, we don't have a lot of history about this guy. We don't know if he even existed, but the Romans said he did, so that's all we've got to work with. He was the son of course, the god Mars, right? This is the idea of connecting your people and your leadership to some sort of divine presence, and the Romans were no different from doing this sort of thing as everybody else was at the time. So here is a video about the origins. It's kind of a wonky video, but it works well for this sort of thing. Whenever we talk about Romulus and his brother Remus, we actually look at these two who are being fed by a wolf, because the origin story has to do with Romulus and Remus being two kids who were raised by a wolf and then eventually fought each other for control of the people that would become Rome. So here's that video.
Legends told that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twins who were cast into the wilderness to die. But the boys were said to be saved by a she-wolf who suckled them. They grew up like savages in the woods. When they returned to found the city of Rome, they were filled with the simple, ferocious spirit of their wolf mother. According to legend, Romulus and Remus then led their people to the bend in the river Tiber, where she found them. There Rome was born. The year was 753 BC. But hardly had they founded the city than the two brothers quarreled over who should be king. Romulus killed him. The first king of Rome, suckled by a wolf, bathed in his brother's blood, walked away furious and triumphant. It was a fitting augury for the bloodshed and strife that lay ahead.
All right. So according to this myth, there would be 7 kings of Rome before the birth of the Republic. And that's just, I think, because that's what had already happened. So people said, well, here's the prophecy. Anyway, here are the kings of Rome until we get to, of course, the establishment of a republic. So Romulus, considered by the Romans to be the founder of the kingdom of Rome. And then, of course, we have Numa, Tullius, Anxius, Lucius, Severus, and again, Lucius. And these guys, I'm not going to test you on these names here. I just wanted to go through them. These folks here are all these kings that served for a while and ultimately were replaced by a revolt of some kind that led to a republic in 509 BCE. The only real date we can corroborate with the beginning of the republic when it comes to records, and we take out things like Mars and she-wolves and that sort of thing, is the 509 BCE establishment of the republic after a revolt. So we have records of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus and the revolt against his rule that led to the republic. That's kind of where we can sit historically and say we have records for this. Okay, take a look at this. We have here the different tribes of Rome at the time that the Romans are going to come into play. Etruria, right here. This is where the Etruscans live, which I've mentioned a few times, because the Etruscans are kind of the big power base in this region, the biggest kingdom, and ultimately Rome is right here. You notice right within the border of Etruria, right here. You then have this area called Umbria, which is still there today. It's just a county now. We have Latium, or the Latins. That's a Latin tribe. Right? And then we have the rest right down this way, other Italian tribal peoples down this way. So when we look at this, we're looking at an interesting byplay of these different tribes, mostly the Etruscans and the Latins right here. And something's going to happen that leads to some power play between these two. So we have the Greek colonies, the Campania. We have the Carthaginians right here on the outside. These guys are going to play a major role. When we talked about the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians are a branch of Phoenicians. At some point, when there is a kingdom of Rome and then a republic of Rome, the republic of Rome is going to want to get into the same business of maritime trade as the Carthaginians are in with the Phoenicians, which means there's going to be probably some big fight at some point between what will become the Romans and, of course, the already existing Carthaginians. Okay, so ultimately, the guys that will be ruling Rome are going to be those Etruscans. And here's the time that they rule, of which those kings come from that I showed you earlier, 616 to 509. About 100 years. So who are these Etruscans? These guys are kind of fascinating. We know about as much as these guys as we know, say, about the Mycenaeans, who ceased to exist well before the Dorians invaded. When I talk about the ancient Mycenaeans, not the Alexander the Great era Mycenaeans we know lots about, but the original Mycenaeans, way back when there was a Minoan Empire and the island of Crete was settled with Knossos. And so when we look here under the Etruscans, what we know about them is really from their burial mounds and the ruins, but we don't know much else about them. We do know that they were a large kingdom, though, and they call themselves the Rasenna. And their armor, it's really very Greek style, which is very common around the entire Mediterranean at the time. And here is a video about the Etruscans.
The Etruscans have long been regarded as the enigma of the ancient world. Predating the Roman Empire by centuries, Etruria emerged out of prehistoric Italy about 900 years before the birth of Christ. They dominated central Italy in the area that is now modern Tuscany, Latium, and Umbria. To resurrect the Etruscan spirit, we must go to their necropolis, their cities of the dead. From their tombs and burial paintings, the shroud of mystery surrounding these people can be parted. They were a festive, sensual people. They loved music and color, celebrations, dancing, horses, and sports. The Greek writer Athenaeus said, "The Etruscans so loved music that they kneaded their bread, practiced boxing, and whipped their slaves to the sound of pipes." The spiritual and mystical aspects of life enthralled them. They emphasized preparations for life after death, practiced faith healing, and hung on the words of fortune tellers and soothsayers. It was an Etruscan priest who divined the assassination of Julius Caesar and warned him to beware the Ides of March. They even predicted their own demise, prophesying that their civilization would last for a period equivalent to 900 years, a prophecy fulfilled with fatalistic and uncanny accuracy. Borrowing freely from other civilizations, the Etruscans transmitted important aspects of culture. They learned the alphabet from the Greeks, adapted it to suit their needs, and passed some of it on to the Romans. But their greatest legacy is perhaps the city of Rome itself. In the 6th century BC, Etruscan kings fortified the city, paved the Forum, created a master sewer system, and built some of the most majestic structures in all of archaic Italy, turning an undistinguished hamlet into an urban center of the 6th century BC. From simple farming communities, the Etruscans developed into a complex society. They formed a league composed of 12 major city-states with a stratified class structure. The aristocracy consisted of the rulers, warriors, landowners, and traders, followed by the artisan class, peasants, and slaves. But even slaves had a degree of social mobility and could achieve higher status. And in an age that was normally male-dominated, Etruscan women enjoyed far more power and freedom than most women of the ancient Mediterranean. Upper-class women freely attended banquets and public events. Many even learned to read. Etruria was a region of rich soil, abundant in timber and minerals. These they traded throughout the Mediterranean, along with shoes, pottery, grain, olives, and grapes. Etruscan civilization reached its zenith at the beginning of the 6th century BC. But by the end of that same century, the archaic world of the Etruscans, with its splendid royal and aristocratic life, had begun to crumble. By the 1st century BC, Etruria was finally overrun by Roman legions led by rival generals Sulla and Marius, and peace did not come to the area until Emperor Augustus claimed control in 31 BC. The Etruscan language was replaced by Latin. Etruscans became Roman citizens, and one of the world's most glorious civilizations vanished.
So that brings us to the names of the two biggest classes of the Romans. Comes out of the Etruscans, and it's kind of lent over to the Latin culture, and the Latins picked this up, which will be the future Romans. The patricians, named after the patris of the nobility of the ancient Etruscans. The patricians are always going to be the noble landowners of Rome. And the plebeians are always going to be the non-landowners, the people that basically work on the land that is run and owned by the patricians. So the patricians get to be part of the upper senate. The patricians get to be consuls, which is kind of like an elected king. The patricians are the ones that hold the land. And then you've got the plebeians, who are, again, the common people. And there were lots of shifts over time over what could be a citizen plebeian and what could not. But that's the difference, right? The entire history of Rome is really a fight politically between the power of the patricians and the power and access to the government that the plebeians had. So for your notes, the patricians, elite wealthy families that owned most of the land and made up the aristocracy of Rome, right? That's a patrician. I just want to keep repeating that because that's extremely important. Then the plebeians, freeborn, meaning they're citizens, but they don't own land typically, and they are the middle and lower classes. So it's not that plebeians were necessarily poor. Often they were wealthy. It's just that they were not born to a patrician family. And those patrician families descend from the tribal leaders of the ancient Latin and Etruscan tribes that meld together eventually. So right here, something I mentioned already, the struggle for power between these two groups would define the Roman Republic during its first centuries. So here's the kind of republic that the Romans come up with. They have an executive branch. Remember, it's a republic, so it's got these different branches of government. An executive branch that has the people that call the shots and enforce the laws. That's your consuls and magistrates. A consul is kind of like an elected king, and a magistrate, that's the person that runs the city. So they're kind of like a powerful mayor. Then the legislative branch, which will have a Senate and legislative assembly. Amazingly, so does the United States. We have a Senate and the House of Representatives. That's what this is. It's almost a direct copy of the idea. And then we have a judicial branch right here, as does the United States and does the Republic of Rome, which involves the councils, that's the lawyers, and the court system. Okay, so this is something that's kind of similar in a way. It's familiar to Americans because we're used to the idea of having three branches of government. Our modern day democracies are in some way borrowed from this, having been shifted over time by the concepts that have come up from more modern philosophers like Montesquieu and John Locke and many others. You do not have to memorize this slide. Please don't try. I just wanted you to see the complexity of the Roman Republic government. And I thought that this would be a fun way to do it, which is to put this up here. In class, when I put this up, usually folks stare at it a bit and then their eyes glass over, and then the students start to rethink their life choices. So let's get into this part then. An elected consul, you guys, the Republic of Rome would elect two consuls every year. A consul is a little bit like an elected dictator. So this is actually something the Spartans would do. They would actually elect two kings every year. Well, that's what the Romans did. They would elect two kings, also known as a consul. And those consuls were the ones that basically ran the military and did things like disaster response and that sort of thing, because the Senate, just like in the United States with our Congress, the Roman Senate took a long time to argue things out. And sometimes you need decisions made very quickly. And that was the job of your consuls. And if consuls did a good job, if these elected kings or elected dictators did a good job running things for that year, they might get elected again to continue running things the following year, and so on and so forth. Why did the Romans elect two consuls? Two reasons. One, sometimes there was enough going on that you needed two people running things like your armies and stuff. The other reason is because the two consuls would fight each other constantly. And that was intended, that was on purpose. In fact, the Roman Senate often would elect two consuls who hated each other and were directly opposed. And this was done so that basically, when the Roman Republic was threatened, those two consuls would get along to protect their home. But the rest of the time, they would kind of argue with each other and make sure that neither person, that neither consul would ever actually become a dictator and try to take over. The Assembly of the Tribes opened to all Roman citizens, and it was the Democratic Assembly. So when it says here, all Roman citizens, you guys, that means the plebeians, the common people, were also part of this. That's different from the way that the Spartans did it, and a little different from the way that the Athenians did it, just to give some comparison. This was something where if you were a plebeian, a common person who was also a citizen, you could be part of the government directly. We have a plebeian council made up only of plebeians. This one here, the Assembly of Tribes, could have patricians and plebeians in it. This one here, the plebeian council, is a whole separate council of only plebeians, only common people. And they had the ability to make certain laws and enforce certain laws as well. And then we've got the Senate, and they're the ones that ultimately can create the consuls, and so it becomes a permanent part of the government, has experience because the Senate's been around since the early kingdom era, and there's tradition because it's been around since the early kingdom period. The Senate is mostly patricians. It's landowners. So you've got the Senate, which is the highest government in the land of Rome, and then you've got these sub-councils like the plebeian council and the Assembly of the Tribes and that sort of thing, which help to make certain kinds of laws. Any proposal passed by the wealthy patricians who were part of the Senate could be vetoed or canceled by the plebeian tribune. And that plebeian tribune is somebody that basically speaks for the plebeians in the plebeian council. So that gave the common people a ton of power. A consul, most powerful position in the Republic, there are always two of them, like I mentioned, elected for just 1 year by the Assembly of Centuries. That's that. Only patricians could stand for consul. So if you're going to be a consul, or you're going to be running for the job of being a consul, a type of dictator, you had to be a patrician, a wealthy landowner. Eventually, there's going to be a point of time where a plebeian, a common person, could also become a consul. Each consul has the right to veto the other consul. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. Right here, we've got two dictators right here in this lower right-hand picture, two dictators. And if one of them says, I want to do this thing, the other one could say no, and that stood. So they had to get along, even though they probably did not like each other, if they wanted to get something done. So they're in charge of the Roman army during times of war. Okay, what does the judicial branch look like? They had 6 judges that were elected every 2 years, and they decided the punishments that criminals would receive. Roman law was based upon the 12 tables, and they're a significant advancement in the history of the rule of law. These are interesting, so I'm going to show you this. These come after a major rebellion of the plebeians, who needed to know that the patricians could be reined in a bit because the patrician landowners were becoming a bit overbearing, and basically the people wanted something that limited the power of the wealthy classes and gave power and defined power to the plebeians, to the common people. So these 12 tables or tablets are laws that are written down that would apply to all Roman citizens. the citizens. How do the plebeians advance over time to the point where they even are able to become a consul? Well, 494 BCE is the first time the plebs meet together as a council. That's when the patricians gave some power over to the common people, mostly to stave off a rebellion. So the plebeian council is created, and we have the election of tribunes. And remember, a tribune can veto something the Senate passes. 450, the law of the 12 tables comes out, which means the Roman legal system is created by 450 BCE, which is supposed to protect all citizens. 445, 5 years later, the patricians and plebeians could actually intermarry, which allows plebeians, in rare occasions, admittedly, to actually enter into the patrician families. 367, a few years after that, the plebeians could be elected as a consul, a dictator. So this kind of shows the rapid advance of the plebeians after 494. By 342, it is mandatory that one consul out of the two consuls are plebeians. So the plebeians now have their own protective legal system. The plebeians have their own body in the government as a governing body in the Senate, and the plebeians are now able to become mandatorily in charge of one half of the Roman system, the Roman executive system. 339 BCE, it is mandatory that one censor was a plebeian. That's another type of executive leader. By 300, half of the priesthood must be plebeian. So the common people over time gained a lot of power, and that's over getting angry and protesting, and the patricians allowing this to happen up to a certain extent. And by 287 BCE, all plebiscites, meaning all rules passed by the plebeian council, had the force of law throughout the Roman state. So this shows a exponential growth over this period of about 150 years of the common people gaining a lot of power in the Roman system. And that is something that I think is something we think about today a lot, because the common people in countries like the United States, through elections and taxes and the rights of protest and that sort of thing, have a decent amount of power as well. All right, a bit about the Roman military. I'm going to show you some video clips of the different aspects of the Roman military, just to show you how efficient this military is going to become. The military is part of a state-standing military system, and when you became a soldier, you were a soldier for decades, and when you retired, you were given land to live on. So the one way you can go from being even a very poor plebeian would be to become a soldier. And at the end of your term as a soldier, you were given property. You became a landowner. So these guys did a lot of work. They were defense and offense. They were also your professional labor forces. When we talk about people that built the monuments of Rome and the roads and the aqueducts, these are the guys that did all that when they weren't fighting or training. They were building things, and that made them rather useful to the Roman Empire, and that's why they were paid well. Let's go through these videos.
There are two main types of soldier. A legionary is a Roman citizen, an auxiliary is not. Each must supply his own equipment and swear an oath of loyalty to the emperor. Legionaries join an infantry unit as part of a group of 8 men, a contubernium, who all share sleeping quarters. New soldiers are stuck with fatigues, dirty jobs, until they secure a specialist post. 10 contubernia form a century, with its own standard bearer, commander of the watch, second in command, and a centurion to lead them all. 6 centuries together make up a cohort, and 10 cohorts, plus a small cavalry unit, the Equites Legionis, make up the biggest Roman army unit of them all, the legion. The legion's symbol is the Roman eagle, borne aloft by the aquilifer. Cohorts in a legion are numbered 1 to 10. Cohort 1 is extra large with 5 double centuries. Its centurions are the senior ranking primi ordines, and the most senior of all is primus pilus, or first file. He can be promoted to be Praefectus Castrorum, camp prefect, in charge of the daily running of the legion. Outranking this camp prefect are 7 men, 6 staff officers, the tribuni, and the commander of the entire legion, the legatus. Back in Rome, he's a member of the Senate, the empire's 600-strong ruling elite. But in the field, he commands his legion of some 6,000 troops, each a Roman citizen. But while these citizen legionaries are the backbone of the Roman army, the non-Roman citizens, the auxiliaries, are the specialists. In auxiliary cohorts, men recruited across the empire use their talents and abilities in the service of Rome. One area of expertise was horsemanship. There are cavalry-only regiments, the ala, a few double-strength cavalry regiments, including one in Britain, the Ala Petriana, also part-mounted cohorts, and when an auxiliary soldier has served the Roman army for 25 years, a great reward awaits. He gets a plot of land, a pension, and all of the rights of a Roman citizen, for him, his children, and the generations to come.
All right, so you have an idea of how that worked. So let's get to the specifics. All citizens are required to serve in some capacity. You could serve, or you will serve, for 25 years. You serve for 25 years, you get land. Non-citizens could serve and get citizenship and sometimes land. But if you got citizenship, then you were able to do a lot as a Roman. So sometimes your big present was you served for a number of years and you were created into a citizen of Rome. Whereas if you were already a citizen, you were guaranteed land once you had finished your 25-year term. The problem with this is going to be a couple hundred years later when the Romans start to run out of land. It means that if you want to serve in the army, you are promised land, and then you have to go conquer more territory so that your soldiers can continue to have land. This was the major way that the Romans were paid for their service in the military. And since Rome is based on its military from offense and for defense, you've got to have it. And this military is also your engineer corps and your builders, your construction artists and everything. So you need the military. They're the biggest, most important aspect of the Roman system. So how do you, what happens when you start, when your empire gets so big that having to keep on conquering more land means that you have to expand beyond what you can protect. And so you start seeing the Romans going into England, across the channel, and going into Persia, and just going way too far from Rome to really be effective. What happens then, right? So we'll talk about that as we get to the empire days. So what is the expansion of the Roman Empire? Well, the Latin Romans will defeat the Etruscans. Okay, that's how it starts. So here's Italy. And what happens is the Latin tribe of Rome will finally beat the Etruscans, and then you have a Roman kingdom, which will turn into the Roman Republic. In Italy specifically, if the Latin Romans conquered somebody, they would create an alliance with that group, and then eventually they would offer citizenship to that group. That's in Italy. The Romans will eventually do this to some outside groups, but most of the time, if they were going to offer citizenship to somebody, they had to be from somewhere down here in the Italian boot. And then eventually the Romans will offer citizenship to some Greeks, and they'll offer citizenship to some Gallic Persian or Gallic barbarians, as they call them, and so on and so forth. But rarely, almost always, the Romans offer citizenship to mostly just Italians, and then to whoever else really would serve in their militaries with distinction. And that's about it. So by 625, Rome controls this entire peninsula. Conquered lands. If you were conquered by the Romans, you were granted a lot of privileges by the Romans because that kept you from rebelling too quickly. You could keep your customs. You can keep your money system. You can keep your local governments as long as they paid taxes and were loyal to Rome. And as long as all these are well handled, then you get to basically be a peaceful part of the Roman Empire. You can see how big the Roman Empire is going to get. This is the Republic phase. This purple part, that's the Republic phase. Then we get the end of the Punic Wars. This is kind of expanding into also the larger Republic phase right here. And then when we get to Caesar in 44, we get to the Empire phase. All right, here we go. This kind of yellowish tan colors, mustard color. So finally, guys, we're going to talk about the Punic Wars. Well, this finally brings us to the first major wars of empire that the Roman Republic is going to fight. Yes, the Roman Republic will become an empire before it itself becomes an empire, and that's a little confusing, I think. It's just the point being is that the Roman Republic will engage in conquering territory before it actually becomes something ruled by an emperor. I don't know if I could put it any different than that. In any case, the place that Rome is going to be fighting, against, the people that Rome is going to be fighting against, are the Carthaginians. We've talked about the Carthaginians before when we talked about the Phoenicians. And so the Carthaginians are an old Phoenician territory, their own empire really, that controls most of the coastline of North Africa and the trading zones in Sicily, Corsica, these two Mediterranean island territories, that is, and also southern Spain. And Rome wants to be able to move into the Mediterranean for its own trade and is coming up against the Carthaginians who are fighting to maintain their supremacy there. So here's the region of Carthage, the territory that they maintain, and Rome wants some of it, especially Sicily. You'll notice that Sicily, of course, is right here, right next to the Italian boot, of which Rome is now maintain control of. And so Sicily is a place that the Romans need for their population because it's got grain. So they want to take it, and that means military action. And of course, the other issue is that the Carthaginian navy is all over the Mediterranean Sea, and it's become a problem. There's been a lot of fighting between the ships of Carthage and ships of Rome. The problem is that the Carthaginians usually win these because they've been at sea for longer and have some ability to fight naval battles. What that means is that the Romans have to figure out how to do it too. And the ultimate bit, I don't have a slide for this part, but just as part of the storyline, the Romans are actually going to capture some Carthaginian warships that are beached because of a storm. And the Romans are going to copy those ships by building their own ships like it, except for one major modification. All right, so the very first Punic War, there's going to be 3 of them, but the first Punic War begins when the Romans invade Sicily for that grain territory. What the Romans do that's different when they copy the Carthaginian warships precipitating this battle of Sicily is the Romans put on this gangplank, all right, this interesting gangplank that can close down. It's got a big spike on it right here. And that gangplank, here's a model of it, can be swiveled on this beam right here, this upstanding pole, can be swiveled and locked down over an enemy ship. What that means is that the very superior Roman army can cross from a ship over to the enemy ship, which is not manned by a real army. The Carthaginians have never had to fight a land army on a boat before. It's never happened that way. So they weren't really ready for that, and that's the way the Romans fought, because the Romans are pretty innovative this way. So the Romans build their navy. The Roman ships have these gangplanks, all right, and legionaries, these professional troops, cross over and capture the Carthaginian ships each time. So the very first Punic War, which is the battle over control of Sicily, results in a win for the Romans. The Carthaginians will sign a peace treaty, which means that Sicily becomes a Roman province right here. And then the Romans are simply going to take Corsica and Sardinia. That's these 2 islands right here. So now Rome owns these 2 islands here and this island here, and the Carthaginians are still in control of their empire over here. It's just that at some point, maybe the Carthaginians are going to want to limit Rome's expansion. So we're going to see the Second Punic War a few years later. And this Second Punic War starts around 218 BCE. And that means that we're going to see a real action. Before, it was just the Roman ships fighting against Carthaginian ships. The Second Punic War isn't really naval. It's army-based. And it's rather interesting because Carthage, which is right down here, is right over here. Carthage is going to organize a large army. And that army is not going to sail to Italy, and the Romans are expecting that. Carthage is actually going to send an army this way along the northern coastline of Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar. They're going to have to ferry everybody by boats. Hannibal, the leader of the Carthaginian army, comes over the Alps mountains, which is a logistical nightmare, and he makes it with 60,000 troops and a bunch of elephants. He left with 100,000 troops, so Hannibal was not able to get everybody over the Alps with him, but he does it, and he's going to fight a number of battles against the Romans, and Carthage will win all of them because the Romans were not ready for this kind of warfare or this kind of attack coming from northern Italy. And this is how it's going to go. There's going to be a bunch of battles. And going over the snowy Alps with elephants, I don't even know how he did it. It's still considered to be a marvel of the ancient world that this guy did this. In fact, this whole campaign, Hannibal's campaign against the Romans, is actually studied in military colleges. This is actually something that is still very relevant today because of how he did it and what he did. But we're ultimately going to have 40,000 Carthaginian infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 60 elephants going over the snowy Alps into Italy. It's just amazing. It takes him 2 months to conquer northern Italy, and then he's going to get the rest of Italy pretty quickly too. The battles that he fights, there's 3 major battles that the Romans try to stop him at. And the last battle where the Romans lose is at this place called Cannae, right here. So right here, we've got Trasimene. Here, let me put them up for you. The Trebia River, Lake Trasimene, and then Cannae right here. I'm going to talk about Cannae. These two are just basically, these are our legions that were sent by Rome, hastily raised, not really ready to go. This was a surprise invasion, so the Romans were not set for this. And the Romans, remember that the Romans elected 2 consuls, 2 dictators, to run their armies. And each of these armies was being run by 2 generals or 2 consuls at the same time, which means that decisions were poorly made. This is something the Romans will have to stop doing. They need their armies run by 1 general, not 2, and they learn a hard lesson from the Second Punic War. So the Romans really have their pride hurt here when they lose this battle, and then Cannae. Oh, this is going to be massive. I'm going to show you a little more about Cannae. All right, here it is. The way the battle starts is something else. Just speaks to the Roman hubris. The Romans attack in 3 lines of their battle formations. They've got their camp here, and they've got, of course, cavalry, because everybody by this time had cavalry. And the job of the Roman cavalry is to stop the Carthaginian cavalry from getting around. So what happens first is that the cavalry, the elephants were not even needed in this battle. They were used earlier. In this event, the Carthaginian army attacks in this arrow formation. They move in and start fighting right here. Then, after about half an hour, the Carthaginian army begins to retreat in the center. The sides stay solid, but in the center. So as the Carthaginian center begins to retreat, they create this type of bowl right here. And what that means is that the Romans, not thinking their way through this, just keep on following the retreating Carthaginian army, thinking that their might is the reason that the Carthaginian center seems to be collapsing. And so what happens is you now have the Carthaginian cavalry here, and the Carthaginians' army all in this bowl. And what happens finally is that after the Roman cavalry is defeated, the rest of the Carthaginian African cavalry come around the rear of the Roman troops and attacks here. The Romans are simply slaughtered in this fight, in the Battle of Cannae. They're just surrounded and slaughtered. They're completely outmatched. This battle is also studied in military colleges, just this battle alone, because of how perfectly it was done. It's something we're studying. This is Hannibal's army that is doing this, and it's just brilliant work. Hannibal becomes the kind of the boogeyman for the Romans for a long time, because after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal is now in charge of Italy for quite a while. He's going to occupy it. He's going to live off the land. His army is going to decimate Italy by raiding the towns there. The only problem is that Hannibal did not have reinforcements coming from Carthage at this point, and Hannibal did not have siege weapons. So he could not actually attack the city of Rome. So behind any big city, the Romans were safe, but that doesn't mean a whole lot because, of course, the farmland and all that is being raided by the Carthaginians for a number of years. Yes, I said years. The Romans are basically locked up inside of their cities while the evil Hannibal is outside plundering the Roman Republic. So, as the notes go, Hannibal is at Rome's doorstep without siege equipment or reinforcements. In Spain, the Carthaginians are not able to send reinforcements because they're fighting against a uprising of Romans that are in the northern part of Spain. There's this guy named Scipio Africanus. Scipio is this general who is going to raise an army in Spain of Romans and Roman allies. And those allies, those Romans, I guess I should say, are going to fight against the Carthaginians while Hannibal and his army is in Italy doing its thing. So Hannibal's army in Italy is the very best Carthaginian army, which means that over here, where Scipio is, he's fighting against what else happens to exist for the Carthaginians, which is not as powerful. So this is a problem. Hannibal can only stay here for a little while, for a few years, just occupying things, right? So finally, Scipio, the Roman general, is going to conquer all of Spain while Hannibal is kind of stuck in Italy. Finally, Hannibal takes the Carthaginian army and retreats back into Spain, and some of the rest of the Carthaginian army comes by sea and actually goes over to Sicily and into Carthage, so going both directions. And basically, Hannibal is trying to get back to Carthage because Scipio keeps on attacking and is now moving into North Africa. And because Scipio's Roman army is moving into North Africa, Hannibal has to come home to Carthage to protect it from the Romans. And finally, in 202 BCE, there is the Battle of Zama, the famous Battle of Zama. And at that battle, Hannibal and his very tired army and the city of Carthage are defeated. So Hannibal won every battle except for Zama. He's going to lose the war. He spread himself too thin and had no way to actually beat the Romans because he did not have a good resupply chain. This is something studied today as well. And he did not have the right equipment to actually defeat the Romans in their walled cities. Okay, so the Carthaginians were winning the war for most of the second fight, the second war, but then they lose at the end. Okay, and of course, Scipio is going to become a household name in Rome pretty much permanently. Scipio Africanus, that's his kind of glory name, the conqueror of the Carthaginians. Scipio is now going to be probably one of the most famous people in Roman history. He is very much like a George Washington or something like that. If we were to go back in time before the age of Caesar and talk to the Romans and say who's the most important Roman, some would definitely say Scipio, because he's considered to be the guy that saved the Roman Republic from the Carthaginians. So Carthage will surrender after the Second Punic War. Hannibal himself will commit suicide. And this is just, to follow up. Hannibal had no siege equipment. Romans' allies did not join him after he was pushing into Italy. Carthage did not need get reinforcements through, that is. The Romans never gave up. They kept on fighting back, especially with Scipio. And the Romans have siege craft, and so they're able to bring siege weapons against Carthage, which Hannibal did not have to bring against Rome. Okay. So there's going to be a third Punic War. The Carthaginians did not ask for this war at all. They were not declaring war or doing anything dangerous against the Romans. The Romans themselves, under a guy named Cato in the Senate, decide that they just need to reduce Carthage to ash. So here's what happens. Carthage is beginning to trade again. And then Rome basically is going to use this as an excuse to declare the third Punic War. So Rome is, again, they were really humiliated by those three battles that defeated the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, and Hannibal's occupation of Rome for years. And so the Romans really want to pay the Carthaginians back. They were the ones that almost beat Rome. And so the Romans are going to send an army into Carthage, and they're going to destroy every building. They're going to kill all the inhabitants, and they're going to those that they didn't kill, they simply enslave. And then this is the nuclear option here. This is like the ancient world's version of nuking something. They're going to bring tons of salt, and they're going to dump salt all over the farmland around Carthage so that nobody could live there because nothing can grow in salted earth. So the Romans just really wiped out the Carthaginians in every possible way that they could. And that's the end of the Third Punic War. So, ladies and gentlemen, the deal is that now the Roman Republic has become a type of empire, even though it does not have an emperor, and it's going to go on for quite a while longer, expanding itself. We're going to get into the empire phase next week.